Welcome to the podcast Pratidhwani, Humanizing Science. I'm your host, GV Pawan Kumar. First and the foremost, thank you all for your excellent response, what I've obtained related to the first episode I posted on my blog. And taking your feedback into consideration, now this particular podcast is available on Spotify. And in a few days, it should also be available in Google Podcast and Apple Podcast. So you can subscribe in any of these particular platforms. The podcast name is Pratidhwani, Humanizing Science. So I've just expanded it so that it can be easily searched across the platforms. And you would surely find the link readily on the Spotify at any given time. You will also find the link to the episodes which I will be posting on my blog, Scatterings. So if you have been following my blog, you can also find the episodes there. And you can listen to the podcast there. Okay, so today's podcast is mainly about the inspirations from Japan. So this is related to a recent trip I made to Japan from April 15 to May 3rd of this year. Japan, as you know, is an advanced country with a large economy, great science and technological power. And also a very interesting country where we can actually learn a lot in understanding how they live, how they do science, and also how they interface with the world. So the fundamental question I have in my mind is to understand how science, technology, and culture can come together. As you know, my goal here in this particular podcast is always to humanize science. I'm interested in knowing the human element which will make the science and technology tick in a particular culture and how it can influence the human life generally, so to speak. And Japan is an excellent kind of country to study in the context of this particular question. So I thought I'll just kind of share with you some of the things which I learned in my trip. This was mainly because the fact that I got an invitation to attend a conference and give a talk, which was part of the International Congress on Optics and Photonics, which was held in a city close to Tokyo, which is called as Yokohama. And the conference name was Optical Manipulation and Structured Matter 2023, OMC, so to speak. So this is a conference which is mainly kind of focused on using light to manipulate matter. So there are a lot of interesting themes related to optical trapping, tweezing, and optical forces, both from a theoretical viewpoint and from experimental viewpoint. It also includes a lot of interesting discussions related to utility of optical manipulation from various technological viewpoints and interestingly from biological viewpoints. So it was a great conference. Thanks to Professor Omatsu from Chiba University, who was the main organizer of this conference. This conference also had a lot of very interesting people from various different parts of the world. Helena Rubinstein Dunlop, who is a legend in optical trapping. Kishan Dolakia from St. Andrews and Australia. Volpe, Giorgio Volpe from University College London, and Abraham Karimi from Canada, and Malcolm Kadodwala from Glasgow University. Interestingly, many of these people actually are now the current supervisors of my past PhD students too. So it was nice to meet some of them and interact with them. So coming back to the question which I'm interested in discussing today is to understand how science technology has kind of amalgamated with the culture within Japan. What did I learn about it and various different aspects. First, in terms of the city in which I actually moved into as soon as I landed in Japan was the city Yokohama. And I did write a couple of blogs on this particular city, especially in the context of how they have been able to interface beautiful architecture and many interesting kind of scientific outlets within a reasonably small area of the land. And Yokohama, by the way, is actually a port city. So Japan has a very interesting history. There was a period from 1600s to roughly 1858 or so, where the whole country actually was kind of insular, meaning they did not interact much with the external world except some parts of the Netherlands, very interestingly. And this period is called as Edo period, where the Japanese actually were kind of closed to the outside world, and they were trying to develop things within their environment. And Yokohama was actually the first place which opened up to the whole world in 1850s. And this is where, if I am correct, there were U.S. ships which actually arrived at Yokohama, and then that was actually kind of the opening of the Japanese economy, so to speak. And then Meiji dynasty rule also started during that particular period, and there were many interesting things which happened later on. But what is interesting is that this particular place happened to be the gateway through which the outside world entered Japan in the modern era, so to speak, in 19th century. And there are very interesting things which is part of the city's history. And one of them actually is a ship museum, which is there right at the center of the city. And since water and land actually are so close to each other, they have made a beautiful museum out of that particular dock. And there are also very interesting small installations of science and technology in public places. That is a beautiful thing. So, for example, one will find a tri-axis pendulum, which is essentially a non-linear dynamical kind of device in the public place, which actually keeps changing its orientation and rotates in various different axes. I've also written a blog on this. I'll link to that particular thing in the notes. Now, the interesting aspect which I found in Japan, and especially within Yokohama, is something called as bazaars. The word bazaar is actually very, very prevalent across various different places in Japan. And that is actually surely a word which has come from somewhere from the Arabic origin, or some specific part of it can probably be also kind of connected to India and other places. And of course, bazaar means the market, and Yokohama Bazaar is one of the things which is very evident when you go to the city center. And of course, technologically a lot more advanced than general kind of places what you find. But you'll find also a lot of people across the world visiting this place because there are beautiful museums and various different things. What I also found very interesting is that because there's a lot of interaction between the ports across the world, as you can imagine, because if you have an opening towards the sea, there will be a lot of visitors. And this is also true even in India, for example, if you see down south or even to a large extent in the eastern part of India, especially around Bay of Bengal or let's say Arabian Sea and other places. A lot of cities actually have had cultural interactions and various different interactions with the outside world. And similarly, in this case, Yokohama also has a lot of installations and interactions. So, for example, I found a very interesting native Canadian Indian art, which actually is a kind of a tombstone which has been installed as a gift from the Vancouver port in Canada. Okay, and this is a beautiful kind of piece of art, which also shows some kind of an interaction with the external world, which happened between Yokohama city and Vancouver city, which are both ports, by the way, and something which is very interesting I found. So they have made a point that they have very strong cultural ties with various different places. And if you go across the city, you'll find a lot of interesting installations, both scientific, technological, and cultural installations. This is something I found very unique about Yokohama. Even unlike other cities which I visited in Japan, Yokohama actually has a unique kind of connection to external world, probably because of this port being one of the first places of entry to the external world. and it's a very fantastic concept, and it also is technological advanced, because you can imagine this conference which was happening is a relatively large conference. There were many people, maybe probably upwards of 1,000 people or so, and our conference was a sub part of this particular whole conference. So you can imagine that if one needs to host such a large crowd, you need to have a huge facility. And that facility in which the conference was held was called as the Pacifico Yokohama. So it's a very big conference kind of a venue, beautiful location just beside the sea, or rather beside the ocean, so to speak. And there are a lot of interesting kind of places which one could visit, of which one of them was the so-called Cup Noodle Museum. It is a fascinating place where they have given a very interesting kind of history about how the instant noodle actually emerged out of Japan. Especially there's a person called as Momofuku Ando, who was the main person who innovated this particular concept of instant noodles. And he was inspired tremendously by various different science and technological progressions which were happening across the world. And if you visit this particular museum, you'll find some fascinating aspects, including some interesting anecdotes related to the Time magazine highlight, where along with Ando, the other person who has been highlighted is N. Narayan Murthy. It's very interesting. And I was pleasantly surprised to see some of the things. I also have written about, I've made a small video blog about this. I will link that in the notes of this particular podcast. Have a look at it. It's quite fascinating. So it also tells you that Japanese have really strong kind of intention to create that historical kind of record of whatever has happened in the future. And going further, I will also explain what is their thought process and why do they do that. And there is something which is very important for us to also learn within India, because there's a lot of rich history in terms of and philosophy in terms of the science we do. Science done in the right way, by the way, in the sense where you actually do systematic, rigorous science, and you do have to really make a very nice historical kind of a record of all the things which have happened. And that is something I think which is slightly lacking in India, and hopefully things actually can change better going in future. Okay, now going further from Yokohama, I next actually moved to the main city of the Tokyo, which is not more than, let's say, 30 to 40 kilometers from Yokohama. Of course, great trains across Japan. So I really went around everywhere in Japan via train, and it was a great experience. I'll also talk about it in a few minutes about that. But the interesting part of going to Tokyo is that you are really kind of, joining a huge sea of humanity. As you can imagine, Tokyo is one of the most densest cities in the world. And I am truly amazed to see how well organized that particular city is. You can take any particular city across the world. Tokyo probably will feature as one of the most densely populated cities in the world. So if you compare that to, let's say, Kolkata, Mumbai, Bangalore, Delhi, these are all cities probably are on par in terms of population density to Tokyo. But what is stunning is the way they have been able to organize this city so that people actually can commute without any hassle at all. And I'm truly kind of awestruck to see how well the city is organized. So I went from Yokohama to Tokyo and reached a place called Roppongi, which is actually a beautiful part of the city, kind of very culturally very rich kind of place. And also houses the National Art Center, which is part of the main cultural kind of destinations to visit in Tokyo. So I did go to this particular art center, and it had a beautiful calligraphy display as part of the museum centers. And what is interesting is in this particular calligraphy display, there were many interesting art forms which were displayed, and the script of Chinese and Japanese have similar roots. So there were various different calligraphy displays which had this particular script. And since I cannot read the language, I was using Google Lens to kind of recognize the script. Interestingly, even Google Lens actually had a lot of problem because it kept kind of mixing up Chinese and Japanese, and it kept giving me the information telling that it could not recognize the exact script. So you can also see that there are some similar roots of scripture between Chinese and Japanese, which dates back to a long period. And I should mention that Japanese, Chinese, and Koreans have very interesting history. I'll also talk a little bit about that. And they have some kind of checkered history between them, because Japan actually was very different from what it is now, vis-a-vis China and Korea, especially in the early 1900s and through the World War period. It has a very interesting history. So my purpose of visiting Tokyo was to visit a couple of universities where I had to give talks and also interact with a couple of groups. So on the first day, I went to Tokyo University of Science, which is actually different from the main University of Tokyo, which I went later. So first I went to the Tokyo University of Science. I was visiting Professor Yutaka's group. And it's a very old university, but also with a very modern campus. Amazing. That is one of the interesting things you will find in Japan. Very old universities have extremely modern campuses and fantastic facilities. And this particular university has very strong research and teaching component associated with, which also has an undergraduate program, which is very central to this particular university, which is the Tokyo University of Science. This is, by the way, a private university. I was actually amazed to see that such an interesting kind of arrangement has been made within the city. And of course, after the talk which I gave, we had a lot of interaction. I had a great time interacting with some of the undergraduate students there, who were many in that particular audience too. And what is interesting is they took me around for a sightseeing of the campus. And when you walk across the campus, on the floor of various different places in the campus, there is actually a very interesting timelines which have been engraved on the floor. So from 1900s to further, there's a very interesting timelines which have been kind of written on the floor. First, in one lane, you will have physics. The other lane, you will have chemistry. Other lane, you have biology. And it's a very beautiful concept. So if you actually keep walking, you will go through various different years, and you will find a milestone associated with that year. Now that is a fantastic way to couple history with history with the science, and also it's not a very kind of complicated technology, so to speak. So it can be emulated anywhere. So for example, this is one of the ideas which a lot of campuses across India can emulate. Without actually having to really spend a lot of money. And it's an interesting concept. So then I went to University of Tokyo, to Takeuchi's group, which is a very, very reputed group in soft matter physics, non-equilibrium physics. And University of Tokyo is a big gun, so to speak, in the academic system of Japan. And there's huge amount of science and technology which actually is kind of researched in the university. So I was visiting the physics department, and I gave a talk. The talk actually also was publicized across the Japanese StatMech mailing list, and the audience were also very, very kind of interactive. That was actually one of the longest talk I gave, including the interactions which I had. And the questions and the quality of the questions were very high, and I really enjoyed talking to the people there. So Japanese system actually has a very kind of hierarchical system in some of the places, it seems. Like there is a full professor, and there is some assistant professors who work with that particular full professor, assistant or associate, and then there are postdocs, and then there's a PhD. So the whole group actually is one one big family kind of stuff. And in this particular group of Takeuchi's in University of Tokyo, I met a lot of students, including some postdocs from India and French postdoc within the group, and also a Chinese PhD student. After my talk, they gave me a kind of a tour of their lab, and Takeuchi himself actually gave me a very beautiful demonstration of turbulence happening in a liquid crystal cell. That is one of his great findings, and has a very interesting paper in PNAS related to this particular observation. It's a beautiful kind of work. I will also try to link that particular paper in my notes. What is interesting is I had this interaction with other students. They explained to me what they are doing, and I was really fascinated. There were some very smart and simple experiments, but the science one was trying to explore in those experiments were very deep. And this is something I'm extremely enthusiastic about, where simple experiments sometimes actually can extract some very meaningful and some very deep answers to questions which are otherwise not feasible to be, let's say, extracted from a numerical model, or let's say theoretical analysis based on some kind of analytical equations. So this approach is a very fascinating thing. Simple tabletop experiments extracting very deep answers to some even more deeper questions. And Takeuchi's group actually is one of the pioneers in such kind of experiments. On the last day of this particular visit to Tokyo University, I went to Tokyo University Museum. This actually was one of the best parts of my visit in Japan, where I went to their museum, and there was some fantastic collection of butterflies and various different creatures, vertebrates and animal stuffings and other things. There was also tremendous collection of minerals, including quartz, turquoise, gold. A very peculiar thing I found was arsenopyrite, which is an interesting element, stone kind of structure, which was fascinating. What is important in this particular museum is the emphasis on chronological science. Okay, that is something which they are very interested in, where they use carbon dating actually to figure out the exact age of the sample what you are interested in. So one of the headings actually read in that particular museum is quote, "Chronological science is interdisciplinary. Radiocarbon chronometry not only enables investigation of past nature and human activities, but also enlightens the future by contributing to climate change forecasting and disaster prevention studies." Stop quote. This actually is a very important kind of thing which I learned, because you can see that they are trying to project these kind of analysis using radiocarbon chronometry to not only dig about the past, but also learn something from that particular study and use it in future for, let's say, forecasting some aspects of climate change and disaster prevention. And this is another very important thing Japanese are always interested in, because of the fact that they are kind of an island country. They are always exposed to sea and of course earthquakes, etc. So that is a central part of their research. And within this particular museum, there is an acceleratory mass spectrometry, which is exclusively used for carbon dating. And the claim is that they can determine the absolute age of the sample with as little sample size as 1 milligram of carbon. So if you actually have, let's say, some kind of, let's say, an insect, and if you can extract 1 milligram of carbon from that insect, they can precisely tell what is the age of that particular insect. And by the way, there are many, many different things which actually would contain carbon in that particular sample. So they are able to determine various different ages of samples of various vertebrates and various different small animals and other things using this particular technique. It is a remarkable facility. I was very, very impressed. And it also shows that how beautifully one can utilize science to really learn something, not only about the past, but utilize the knowledge from the past and put it into the future use. And this is, I think, a great way of humanizing science, so to speak. A museum is always a great place to do such kind of thing. What you'll also find if you go to this museum in the vicinity, especially near the physics department, is the science gallery. And the physics department of Tokyo University has stalwarts who have got Nobel Prizes. For example, Koshiba, who was involved in the neutrino detection using superconductor detector. There's a lot of information on him and various different people, including the person who actually got the Nobel Prize for the weather forecasting kind of complexity principle. He's actually an undergraduate, I think so, from the Tokyo University, if I'm correct, from the physics department. So they've beautifully made the science gallery highlighting this. In there, you'll also find a beautiful photomultiplier tube, which is used in this Super Kamiokande detector. And by the way, Super Kamiokande detector is actually a neutrino detector. As you know, neutrinos are extremely hard to detect, and you need some very sophisticated methods to count the neutrinos which actually are falling onto that particular detector. And a photomultiplier tube is used. So I actually saw a prototype which is placed in the science gallery, which was 50 centimeters in diameter. 50 centimeters. Imagine you just imagine a bulb, and the radius of that particular, or the diameter of that bulb is about 50 centimeters. It's not a trivial thing, and it's one of the highlights of the visits there, because I have never seen such a big photomultiplier tube, and it's truly fascinating. Now, this was actually the stuff what I learned in Tokyo. So now I moved off the mainland and went to the beautiful Okinawa prefecture. Okinawa is off the mainland. Okay, this is far away from the mainland of Japan, and it has also a very interesting and rich history off the shore of Japan. So essentially, this particular prefecture is placed somewhere in the middle of the oceans. Both on one side is the Indian Ocean and the other side is the Pacific. So it has some very interesting kind of geography also associated with this. Now, what is interesting is that it also is a place where Japanese are trying to really build a strong tie with the mainland, and also they are trying to put in a lot of money to bring this particular place as an international center for science and technology. And one of the institutions which actually is kind of the prototype for this particular thought process is Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology. So it is an international institution, fantastic facilities, huge campus, and they're very, very impressive in terms of of their architecture. They started roughly about 2010, 11 or so, but the kind of stuff they have built is truly impressive. So there I, of course, was visiting Professor Mahesh Bandi. I was also kind of interacting with Professor Pinaki Chakrabarti and Sheila Kromek and Keshav Dani and other people. So I visited all these groups. I gave a talk again on some aspects of non-equilibrium kind of dynamics of colloids in an optical trap, and had a very interesting interaction with all of them. What is important is I also met a lot of Indian students, including students from IISER Pune, undergraduate students, and I had a great interaction with some of them. They also explained to me how research is performed there, and what is the fundamental difference between students who are from Japan and doing PhD. How do they approach? For example, an organic chemistry student from India was describing to me how they approach things. And it was fascinating. Really, really. I learned a lot of interesting things from them. Of course, I also met a couple of PhD students and a lot of postdocs who are from India, both from IISER Pune and from IISER Kolkata. And I also have written a blog about the interaction with them, and I'll post it on the link too. What is interesting is that OIST is kind of an example of creating a great facility and where you are essentially away from the mainland. And this is also true in various different cities or places within India. So one crucial element which I found is that if you create a great connectivity with facilities, connectivity is the crucial element here. If you can connect any place which is slightly away from the mainland, but somehow if you manage to connect that particular mainland to a far off place, then you really can develop institutions very interestingly. That's a very, very fascinating kind of progression which they have made, and there's a lot to learn. I was more interested in looking at how groups are working there, how laboratories function. They also have a very rich marine biology unit, rich in the sense not only in terms of the funding but also in terms of the science and technology what they're trying to develop. And I learned a lot interacting with few students who were actually in physics group doing something related to physics, using marine biology as one of the core experimental tools. And there is a very, very fascinating kind of story behind all those things which I was seeing. So as I actually spent time in Okinawa, I also felt that Japanese are indeed interested in technology as much as in science. This is a very important part of Japanese kind of progression over the years. And I also spoke to a lot of professors in various different places, and they kept telling that their technological advances are much, much more than even the conventional scientific kind of progression. Not that they're not doing good science, but their emphasis is more towards the engineering part. So what I found very interesting is once I moved from Okinawa to the next city, which is the Osaka, and which is probably one of the most beautiful cities I've ever visited. And I was visiting Professor Hajime Ishihara's group in Osaka University. And in that particular university, which again has a very rich history dating back to 1930s or so, I was actually visiting the engineering science department. Okay, so the idea is that you use engineering to do science. And this particular department which I was visiting actually had one of the core interest in optical manipulation. Professor Ishihara's group is actually very well known in optical trapping, especially there's a very famous PRL paper on semiconducting structures being trapped using optical beams, and what new aspects are emerging out of that. And I had fascinating time discussing a lot of interesting things with Professor Ishihara and his group members, including students and postdocs. Great sense of humor. We had a lot of fun interacting science and also, talking about various different things. We talked a lot about aspects related to how optical trapping actually can be used to understand some fundamental physics, and also some very interesting applications. For example, I learned that they were trying to use fiber-based optical traps, where you essentially take an optical fiber and pull that particular fiber, and you try to actually sample this particular fiber with various different sizes of nitrogen vacancy diamonds, okay, or nano diamonds, so to speak. So what this fiber does is it will help you to actually sort the nano diamonds by their size. And this is one of the recent papers which I found very interesting, and they explained to me how they're doing this kind of experiments and other things. Ishihara's group is a theoretical physics group, but there are also various different groups which were doing experiments in that particular place. Of them, the experiments on optical trapping in liquid helium, I found it very, very fascinating, because they were trying to see what changes one can actually find if you have a phase transition in liquid helium. Because as you know, probably will be aware that helium undergoes transition from a kind of a superfluid to a normal fluid. And that is a fascinating kind of physics too, because it becomes a quantum fluid. And they were trying to do optical trapping in such kind of environments where you have liquid helium. And the experimental technique and the concept behind that, I found it very, very fascinating. So of course I gave the talk, and that was actually one of the largest audience I got during my trip. There were various different students across Osaka, because there are various different groups who are interested in optical manipulation. And I was mainly talking about how optical induced heating actually can influence manipulation. So I talked about what happens to colloids, in such kind of environments, what are the interesting interactions one can expect, what is the basic kind of statistical mechanics one can encounter in such situations. So it was a fascinating kind of an interaction, and again the questions were very, very good. So post talk, then we had a very long kind of interaction about various different aspects. One of the key aspect was the question of the influence of China in the socio-political aspects of our respective countries. In fact, as you probably would be knowing, there are new developments, especially across the South China Sea and other places. So Japanese actually are kind of now cognizant to that, and I could feel that there is some kind of some kind of friction now which is there between the political class of these two countries, and that probably is also affecting the scientific kind of exchanges which are happening. Although I came to know that still there is a lot of interaction which happens in that peninsular region, and scientists go back and forth across these borders. And many of the Japanese professors, for example, Professor Sano, who is a very, very well-known person in Tokyo University, statistical mechanics, turbulence, is now post-retirement has taken up a job in Taiwan. So you could see that there's a lot of exchange for professors and positions for them across the sea. They would be able to exchange a lot of people in that way. But there's still some kind of a kind of an atmosphere which is not that conducive for very kind of free form of exchange of ideas between the countries. And they were also curious to know how is the relationship between India and China. And I was explaining some of the things which have happened in the past few years, and how things actually are not in great shape in that way too. Politics you cannot actually remove from the general discussion. That is one of the crucial elements about doing science, because science doesn't happen in isolation, you see. There's always an element of people, politics, economics associated with science. And one will not be able to avoid that particular element anytime you interact with people. And of course, one of the other topics which we were discussing is about the gender, the representation of women in science, especially in physics departments. And it happens so very similar to India that representation is very poor. In fact, I hardly met any female professors except in the conference. I had a very interesting interaction with a couple of female professors, outstanding people. They were doing some excellent work. But I also was asking them what is the thing. They kept telling that things are actually changing slowly, but they expect it to happen in slightly faster pace, very similar to Indian situation. Especially in physics, there is some issue, I think so. If you look at, for example, biology, I think the representation is reasonable in terms of gender. Chemistry is probably also doing okay, but physics, I think, has an issue. And this is something a lot of people are also thinking within India. And I also heard some interesting talks in IISER Pune about this particular topic, and I hope to actually talk and highlight this point going forward in the podcast at some point of time. The other point which we were also very interested in is about the global science aspect. Interestingly, throughout this particular trip, I have been actually carrying and reading a fascinating book. I'll strongly recommend this book to anybody, which is the title is Horizons, A Global History of Science by James Poshkett. I'll definitely do a podcast on this particular topic of global science, especially from a historical context. So Poshkett's the point is that the development of modern science is not an Eurocentric phenomenon, which means that there was contributions from various different places across the world, from South America to Africa, of course, from Asia and Oceania, etc. So the development, what happened in late 1600s to all the way to 2000s, need not have to be always associated with the Eurocentric viewpoint, which is generally the case when you talk about modern science, so to speak. But he really gives very rigorous kind of historical kind of evidences to prove his point. And he's a professor of history in University of Warwick, Cambridge history PhD. Very interesting person. I also heard him online. Fascinating research area, very close to my own interest. What I have to, I'm also reading his book, and hopefully I'll highlight some of the stuff which I am fascinated about. So a couple of things which I really was interested was in the context of the visit. There was a person called Nagoka in 1903, for example, in Osaka University, by the way, in the same university where I was visiting. And he gave a model called as Saturn model for atoms. And this model actually happened to be crucial for Rutherford's experiment, where he determined that beautiful alpha kind of particle scattering experiment, which gave the presence of the nucleus and other things. Rutherford, by the way, cites that paper. Nagoka's paper of 1903 actually is cited in Rutherford's paper. And James Poskett's book actually tells that, see, there is some evidence which was there even before that crucial experiment. And somehow we don't highlight the non-European contribution when it comes to some of the important discoveries. Another fascinating thing which I was learning from this book is something outstanding. I'm going to talk a little bit more later in another podcast, is that the first ever English translation of the research papers on special and general theory of relativity of Albert Einstein was done by two outstanding Kolkata scientists, Meghnad Saha and Satyendranath Bose. So they did this in 1921. And amazing thing is the whole world, especially the English educated world, actually learnt about Einstein's work reading Saha and Bose. And this is something I was not aware. This is something which probably should be given a little bit more attention to when it comes to how knowledge actually spreads and percolates. And it need not be always Eurocentric. I'm not actually anyway telling that European science is not good or something like that. It's great. As I told, I have been partly kind of educated there. But I felt that I feel that this particular element is something very important for us to appreciate. That science evolves as a global kind of endeavor, and that is something which is very, very important. I also was reading a very interesting editorial in Science magazine, which has appeared, asking who should be able to do science, and I'm going to link that also in the notes. And you will see that there are some very interesting points made on how science is actually a human activity done across the world, and how emphasis should be given to various different things and things like that. Now, of course, there were a lot of interesting things which were discussed over the dinner, and I really enjoyed interacting with the scientific community there. Learned a lot. They are also very kind of closed culture, but if you really open up and talk to them slowly in a systematic way, they would also slowly open up and talk to you. And once they have set a kind of a comfort level with you, they will really talk freely and have a very free and very interesting exchange of ideas, which I really enjoyed. So then I finished my trip to Osaka, then headed back to Tokyo to come to India, and I took a bullet train. And that is one amazing thing which I was kind of stunned to experience. It's called as Shinkansen, and there I took a fast train from Osaka to Tokyo, and it was a 500 odd kilometer ride, which was covered within 2 hours, some few minutes, and the accuracy of departure and arrival was to the seconds. And that's something which is fantastic about Japanese system. Their systematic kind of progression in terms of accuracy and in terms of also, timely kind of delivery of things and things like that. And what is interesting also is that they have very rich culture in food, which I have not spoken at all. But I could manage both vegetarian and non-vegetarian food. And noodles was one of the fascinating things which I also encountered. A lot of interesting food. related to various different vegetables too. And also they have various different dishes related to meat, depending upon the nutritions. They really don't actually have a lot of carbohydrates in their food. That is something which I found very, very interesting. And probably there is something which is related to the way they actually have a very long life expectancy. There's something to learn there too, which it's very interesting. So overall, this is actually what I also felt, that they have very fascinating culture. They bring science, technology, and everything together. And across the Japan, wherever I actually went, I either took trains or I also took a lot of paths by walking. And that is something which I really like. I could get a feel for the culture and other things. So I used to actually take Google Maps and try to navigate throughout the pathways where I was taking. And interestingly, the Google Map actually, if you're walking, it actually keeps changing the direction and it does things. So this also reminded me about this this fascinating and beautiful song by Kishore Kumar, Musafir hu yaro nagar hai na tikana. So there is actually a couple of lines which are beautiful. Ek raah ruk gayi to aur jud gayi, main muda to saath saath raah mud gayi. That's a beautiful line, which I think would tell the pathways I took within the Japan, the inspirations I derived from Japan. And at the end of the trip, all I had to do was kind of tell to myself, मुसाफिर हूँ यारो, ना घर है ना ठिकाना, हमें जाना है, सिर्फ चले जाना है. Shukriya. This is Pratidwani, and meet you sometime later. Bye-bye.